Truth Espresso, episode 238.
Face it, we all would rather sleep in this morning. That's why God gave us espresso, to kickstart our zombified corpses into hyperdrive. And now, giving your mind and soul the morning shot of truth it craves. This is Truth Espresso with Daniel Minnick.
Hello, this is your host, Daniel Minnick, for another episode of Truth Espresso. I am kind of going solo this episode. Well, I'm reviving one from 14 years ago with family visiting and birthdays. It's a lot of busyness going on and not enough time to come up with some notes for continuing our series on the revivals in American history. So I'm resurrecting something that I did back in 2009. And this was during a time where my father-in-law was having some Bible studies, and we had an older couple over to participate in the studies, and I was kind of guest teaching it for 2 weeks, and I was teaching on the topic of tithing. Now, it might not be the position that you might be accustomed to. I was in the process of writing a book, which turned out to be my book, Freedom to Give, the Biblical Truth About Tithing, that was published in 2011. So this was while that book was in its infancy drafts, and I was teaching through some of the studies that I did that were in preparation for this book. And I taught 2 different weeks, the first one on the Old Testament passages, and then the second one on the New Testament passages primarily, and I have not been able to find the Old Testament the first week, but I found the second week covering the New Testament. I did allude to and discuss some relevant passages in the Old Testament. And I apologize that the audio quality isn't clear. I wasn't speaking into a microphone like I'm recording right now. I had an audio recorder next to me going to record the lesson, but I think you'll find that it's still a little bit understandable, and I hope that you enjoy this lesson in what does the New Testament really say about tithing.
So before we get into any of the passages, can anyone recap some of the points that we looked over yesterday about the nature of tithing in the Old Testament? What are some facts that we learned about tithing in the Old Testament?
Well, we talked about giving animals or food for your percentage of the gift, firstborn, or not firstborn, but the first choice, or the best choice, instead of second, third, or fourth choice as being the number one part of the tithing program.
So, yeah, one point would be that it was always food, it was always crops and livestock that grew in the boundaries of the Promised Land. And another fact would be that the people, when they tithed, it was always the 10th thing that they counted, not the first of the 10.
Right.
So that if they had 29 goats, they would tithe 2 rather than 3.
Right.
And they wouldn't tithe 2.9 goats. Any other facts that you can remember?
And then there's the whole scandal with the priest about just taking from the tithing. They were taking not the best of theirs to give to God, and then also they were...
That had to do with offerings.
Yes.
How they were robbing God in offerings by offering blemished animals on the altar.
And then they were also stealing from God in tithes by the storehouse ones.
Yeah, Eliashib and Tobiah, where Eliashib built a chamber in the temple to house and feed Tobiah off of the tithes that should have gone to the Levites as they ministered yearly in the temple. When it was the turn for the Levites, they were broken into families, and each family would take a turn ministering in the temple probably about 2 weeks out of the year. The rest of the year, the Levites actually farmed in the Levitical cities. But when it became their turn to minister in the temple, they would live off the tithes that were brought to the temple storehouse chambers. But then when we had the scandal with Eliashib and Tobiah, they were stealing all the tithes that were to go to the Levites, and so when the Levites were there, they couldn't be fed. So it said in Nehemiah chapter 13 that they were all scattered back to their fields. And then when Nehemiah came back and found out what was going on, then he said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" And we see how that's similar to what we find in Malachi chapter 3. Another fact, if you can remember, was that the annual tithe, the tithers, everyone brought their tithes to Jerusalem, and they had a big feast. I think it was, if I remember from another passage, I think this was the Feast of Tabernacles, was the feast where everyone tithed, but they brought their tithe, and if the way was too long for them, they could convert it to money, bring the money, and purchase back tithable commodities, crops and livestock, and then they would have a conglomerate feast there in Jerusalem. They would eat their own tithe, they would share with the Levites that were there. And another fact was that only every 3 years did people actually give their tithe away, and this went to the Levites and the poor. And the third year tithe, the tithe of every 3 years, which is called the year of tithing, that was the tithe that actually went to the temple storehouse. That's a recap of the Old Testament tithing. And then we're going to look at some New Testament incidents to see if the New Testament teaches tithing for Christians. So if we want to turn to Matthew chapter 23.
What verse are we at?
23. Chapter 23 and verse 23.
Oh.
Does anyone want to read that verse?
"Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cummins, but you neglect the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." So
we have here is Jesus is both commending and condemning the scribes and Pharisees for their actions. Is there anything about this particular verse that might stand out? Here we are in the New Testament during the ministry of Jesus. Anything in particular that stands out where Jesus is referring to their tithing?
Well, they're still tithing with a type of crop or something that grows.
Mm-hmm. He's telling them that you're tithing of spices or garden herbs, and while they were rejecting the weightier matters of the law, justice, and mercy, he tells them, you should do what you're doing, but don't leave the other undone. Make sure that you do show justice and mercy. And so he didn't say there's anything wrong with their tithing in particular, but the fact that they're doing it, they should do that and keep weightier matters of the law. But what's interesting is that it says that they're tithing, mint, anise, and cumin, or spices, or garden herbs, which is another type of food. Of course, a lot of preachers will use this verse where Jesus tells them that they should have been doing what they're doing, they're tithing, and say, see, Jesus commended tithing, therefore that's a message for us that we need to tithe. But, they miss this detail where it says that what they were tithing of, it says mint, anise, and cumin, different spices. If Jesus said, this ought ye to have done, and this message is exactly for us today, then is Jesus telling us that we need to tithe of mint, anise, and cumin? Because that's exactly what he said. This ought ye to have done. So are we supposed to do that? No, I'll just have to figure out from the context. Of course, he's talking to the scribes and Pharisees. Right. And then if we look at verses 1 through 3, or actually down through 4, do you want to read that, Chelsea?
Sure. Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they say to observe, that observe and do. But do not be after their works, for they say and do not. For they find heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers.
So what we'll find out, Jesus is talking to the scribes and Pharisees, and he's talking to his disciples, and he tells the disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So obviously, they're referring to the law, right? Moses' seat would be the Mosaic law. And so when Jesus is commending the scribes and Pharisees for their tithing of mint, anise, and cumin, they're in effect following the tithe laws, and we still see that what they were tithing was of food, even though I don't think the law said that you had to tithe of little garden herbs and spices. I think, this was an instance of him saying that they're going to the extreme with this action while neglecting the other action. But if they're going to do that, which is a good thing to do, he tells them, you should do that if you're going to do that, but don't neglect the other matters of the law. But what I can gather from here is that since they sat in Moses' seat, this is kind of still the dispensation of the law, and what they're doing was doing in accordance to the law, so I don't see where the audience of what Jesus said really pertains to the church and how the church actually operates. A lot of people will overlook the fact that he said you tithe mint, anise, and cumin. So we have a sticky situation. If you're going to use that verse to say that Jesus commended tithing, we follow Jesus, therefore we're supposed to do what he said, and he said what they were doing was good. Well, what did he say they were doing? They were tithing mint, anise, and cumin. Do you do that? You don't. Well, then if this is what Jesus says to you, you're disobeying it because you're not tithing mint, anise, and cumin. Look what he said. He said, this ought you to have done, tithe mint, anise, and cumin. So either we're supposed to tithe mint, anise, and cumin, which, from the context we determine is referring to the law, or this was, we're not the audience he's talking to. He's talking to the scribes and Pharisees, which were the ones who copied and taught and practiced the law and were examples of the Mosaic law to the Jews there.
Well, here it says Jesus accused the Pharisees of focused on minor details while neglecting the main points of the law.
They were pretty much going to an unnecessary extreme with their tithing, outward actions like that, and then they were neglecting the actual virtues of the law, judgment, mercy, grace. But if someone's going to try to use that verse to say we're supposed to tithe, if you're going to take what he said literally, either you have to do what he said and tithe mint, anise, and cumin, or it doesn't apply to us.
Right.
Because it's still talking about the Jews and the Mosaic law, and I would say it doesn't apply to us in that instance. Because if it did, no one I know anywhere obeys what he said. There's a similar verse in Luke. It's Luke 11:42, and it's a different account of the same occurrence, so we don't have to look at that, but it's the same woes to the scribes and Pharisees, and it's worded slightly different. So that's basically the scope of tithing in the New Testament. And it's still in the dispensation of the law, or Mosaic law, Jesus' ministry to the Jews. The scribes and Pharisees were Jews. They were practicing the law, or at least saying that they were. And this instance of Jesus commanding them for their tithing, we find from the context it doesn't really apply to us, because if it did, we're all breaking it. So, it's not really legitimate to use that to say that Jesus is telling us that we're supposed to practice tithing, of course, monetary income, that they apply in the church. Now we're going to go to Paul's epistles, and we're going to look at a passage that people will often use to teach tithing, and we're going to find out whether or not that particular passage actually does teach tithing. If you could turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and it will be verses 1 and 2. Does anyone want to read those two verses?
Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye, upon the first day of the week, that every one of you lay by him in store, as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come.
In some churches, if you visit, you might see like envelopes, and then they'll list 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, and then they'll say, they might list these two verses, and then they'll also list Malachi 3:8 to 10, and say, okay, we should give our tithes and offerings, Now, are these verses talking about the church, that the church should give, the people of a church should give tithes and offerings, assuming of their monetary income, to their own church? Do you think these two verses are talking about that?
Well,
we'll find out,
it says Galatian churches,
And it says collection for the
I guess it's more than one church. I guess each church probably does their own or whatever.
We hear the phrase collection for the saints.
Yeah.
So often think that means, okay, pass the plate around, put some money in. Well, to figure out the context, I'm going to read verse 3. And it says, previous verse, that there be no gatherings when I come. And then verse 3 it says, and when I come, whomsoever you shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. So what we have here is Paul is telling at least the Galatian church and the Corinthian church, the churches to save up whatever money or whatever, so that when Paul gets there, there'll be no gatherings, and they'll be prepared to give him so that he'll bring it to Jerusalem. So from this passage, it's not talking about giving for your own church. It's talking about giving for a remote church. And then we'll look at a bunch of other passages for the context to determine exactly what's the condition and what's the scenario that he's talking about. Now we'll go to Acts chapter 11, and then it will be verses 27 through 30. And I guess I'll read those verses. Acts 11 verses 27 through 30 says, and in these days came prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch. And there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be a great dearth or famine throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren which dwelt in Judea, which also they did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul, or Paul. So we see here that there's a prophet in Jerusalem who predicted that a famine was going to come throughout the land of Judea, and they sent Barnabas and Paul to send relief to them. And this is going to be the context of 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 2. Now we can turn to Romans chapter 15, and then we'll start in verse 24. I guess it goes down from verse 24 down to the end of the chapter. Do you want to read that, Chelsea?
Whensoever I take my journey into Spain, I will come to you, for I trust to see you in my journey, and to be brought on my way thitherward by you. At first I be somewhat filled with your company, but now I go into Jerusalem to minister unto the saints. For it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. It hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of the spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal things. When therefore I have performed this, and have sealed to them this fruit, I will come by you into Spain. And I am sure that when I come unto you, I shall come in the fullness of the blessing of the gospel of Christ. Now I beseech you, brethren, for Jesus Christ's sake, and for the love of the Spirit, that you strive together with me in your prayers to God for me, that I may be delivered from them that do not believe in Judea, and that my service which I have for Jerusalem may be accepted for the sake of the saints, that I may come unto you with the joy by the will of God, and may with you be refreshed. Now the God of peace be with you all. Amen.
So this passage is in the same context of that famine in Judea, and specifically the church in Jerusalem. Paul is telling the Romans that he's going to deliver a contribution to relieve some of the saints there. Study about Paul and his missionary journeys. So this is part of his missionary journey, and in his letter to the Romans, he's telling them that he wants to come visit them, but right now he has to go deliver some aid to the saints in Jerusalem. And it says that the churches in Macedonia and Achaia are the ones that contributed toward this relief effort. So we're still seeing here that there's a famine in Jerusalem, and Paul is the one in charge of delivering it to them. And if you remember from 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, he's telling the Corinthian and Galatian churches to save up some money or stuff once every week. The first day of the week, lay by him or lay by the one who's giving in store, so that when he comes, there'll be no gatherings. In other words, he doesn't want to show up there and say, we need some relief, could you give? Oh man, I'm not prepared to give. He's telling them ahead. He's on their way there, but they get his letter, and he tells them, As I told the churches in Galatia, I want you to do this too. Once a week, I want you to save up as God has prospered you so that when I come, I don't have to gather it. It's all there for me. And you can load, basically load onto a ship, and he'll head to Jerusalem. And we can look at 2 Corinthians chapter 9, and we can look at, anyone want to read verse 7?
Each man should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver.
So we notice from that verse, it says that everyone should give not of necessity, but cheerfully. So if someone was required to give 10% of his income to the church, would that be of necessity? If someone were required by God to give 10% of their monetary income to the church, would that be of necessity? Would that be giving of necessity?
Well, if God requires it,
Yeah, but here in this verse it says, every man according as he purposed in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity or under compulsion. So, if someone were required to give a specific amount of their own income to the church, would that be under compulsion or of necessity?
No. If we compel to give according to the external standard, the heart is cut out of the gift. Such giving is a matter of works, not grace. Does the amount we give indicate God's grace to us?
So basically, from this verse, it seems that what we give is out of what's in our heart, not out of any kind of external requirement.
Yeah.
But we also find that this verse, if we read the whole chapter, we find out it's in the same context of giving toward that famine relief in Judea. I guess I'll read a few verses here. Starting at verse 1, it says, for as touching the ministering to the saints, which is the ministering to the saints in Jerusalem, it is superfluous or not necessary for me to write to you, for I know the forwardness of your mind, for which I boasted you to them of Macedonia, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal hath provoked very many. Yet have I sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this behalf, that, as I said, you may be ready. Lest, happily, if they of Macedonia come with me and find you unprepared, we, that we say not you, should be ashamed in the same confident boasting. And the whole chapter is still talking about, it mentions Macedonia and Achaia. Those are the two churches that we saw earlier that gave a large gift of aid for the church in Jerusalem because of the famine there. Here he mentions that again. And we see the context of the whole chapter is still talking about that same famine in Jerusalem. Paul tells the Corinthian church regarding this famine, everyone according as he purposed in his heart, so let him give. And this is also the same Corinthian church that, this is 2 Corinthians, and 1 Corinthians chapter 16, that was concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. So, this is all talking about that same famine. And the collection for the saints isn't talking about a collection for elders or pastors of a church or the presbytery or whatever. It's talking about the people of the church of Jerusalem, the collection for them to relieve them of famine.
Ding dong! Jehovah's Witnesses. Ding dong! Mormons. Christian, are you ready to defend the faith when false religions ring your doorbell? Do you know what your Muslim and Jewish friends believe? You will if you get Andrew Rappaport's book, What Do They Believe? When we witness to people, we need to present the truth, but it is very wise to know what they believe, and you will get Andrew Rappaport's book at whatdotheybelieve.com.
It's pretty interesting to notice the context of a lot of these passages that people often read a verse here and there, as a principle, and they don't see the context. So when sometimes the people will look at 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2 and say the collection for the saints, they're thinking of passing a plate around, people putting their money in, and that goes to that own church's budget. That's not what that verse is talking about, because it said, he's telling the churches of Galatia and Corinth on the first day of the week, Of course, most people assume that that's talking about like a worship service on Sunday, which I don't think the context of that's talking about. I think it has to do with whenever people would be paid weekly. He's telling him once a week, you've been paid. Now that you've been, as God has prospered you, lay a portion aside by him in store. Of course, some people will take by him in store refers to the storehouse of the temple, and that's the church. You can't draw that link. It says lay by him, the one who's giving, you should lay by him in store, kind of like you have a savings account where every time you're paid, you set aside a portion into that account. So everyone should lay by him in store as God is prospering, so that when Paul arrives at that church, they already have something set aside that they can give to him, and then he was going to bring that liberality unto Jerusalem to minister to the poor saints which are there. So it looks like that passage is not talking about tithing of your monetary income to your own church. For one thing, it doesn't mention tithing at all. Some people take some phrases for it, but they misinterpret those phrases. Number two, it doesn't even talk about giving to your own church. Now, I'm not saying that you're not supposed to give to your own church. It's just that passage is not talking about it. It's talking about meeting the needs of a remote church. We don't know whether he's talking about money or food or both. It's some kind of aid that those churches were instructed to do to give to Paul so that he can deliver it to relieve the famine aid in Jerusalem. The last argument for tithing that people will have is, well, you're talking about the law. If we're not under the law, but the Bible does have instances of tithing or tithing before the law. Abraham and Melchizedek. Abraham gives a tithe to Melchizedek, and Jacob made a vow to God after the vision of the ladder. When he woke up, he said that he made a vow to God that if God would bring him to his father's house and keep him safe and do as he promised, then he would give a tenth of everything to him, which from Jacob's vow, it was a conditional vow. He said, if God will do this, then I will give a tenth of whatever to him. So from Jacob's vow, it was a conditional vow. This is in Genesis 28. I don't want to take the time to read them, but Jacob's vow, it's ambiguous. We don't know what he was talking about. Was he talking about giving to God a tenth of his income or what? And if so, how did he do it? Who did he give it to? Did he, toss it up in the air and God with chariots came down and scooped it up? We don't know what he's talking about and how he did it. If he did it, we don't have any account of him actually fulfilling it, so we don't know exactly what he was talking about. What I suggest is, where God named Jacob Israel, I think that Jacob's vow to God, where God said, where Jacob told God that if he brought him back safely to his father's house, he was relating to his vision, the vision of the ladder, and the vision had to do with Jacob being the chosen seed through Abraham, through which the nation of Israel would come. And so I propose that Jacob's vow itself was not something that Jacob actually himself did, or that it was actually fulfilled in the nation of Israel and the tithing laws that God gave to the nation of Israel. Jacob's vow was fulfilled in the nation of Israel performing the tithe laws. So with that's still, I'd say that's Jacob's vow, even though it was before the law. It still had to do with the nation of Israel, and it was linked to the law in that respect. And so now what we're left with is Abraham, and a lot of people say, look, Abraham tithed before the law, therefore, since if we're not bound by the law, we could still be bound by what Abraham did because what he did was before the law. Which is kind of a silly argument on its face, because God commanded Abraham to circumcise his children. He said this will be a covenant between you and me forever. There's no instance where God actually commanded Abraham to tithe. We don't see that. We just see Abraham giving a tithe to Melchizedek. But God actually commanded Abraham to circumcise his children. So if we're going to take the argument that whatever Abraham did that was before the Mosaic law, we're bound to do the same thing. Well then, based on Abraham being actually commanded by God to circumcise his children, are we bound to do that? Well, no. We find in Galatians where Paul himself said that, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision availeth anything. So, just because Abraham did something or himself was commanded by God to do something doesn't mean that just because it's before the law doesn't mean we who are not bound by the law are bound by what Abraham did. We're going to look at the account of Abraham and Melchizedek as it found in Hebrews chapter 7, and we'll find out whether Abraham's tithe and Melchizedek is something that we have to do. Anyone want to read verses 1 through 5? Hebrews chapter 7.
For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returned from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. To whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace. Without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. And verily they that are of the sons of Levi, who received the office of the priesthood, having commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham.
So what we have here is the account of Abraham giving a tithe to Melchizedek. Is there anything to note about the characteristic of Abraham's tithe to Melchizedek?
Well, it seems like, wasn't it more like spoils from a war?
Yeah, that's precisely what it was. This wasn't his job, his wages, where he tithed of his monetary income. This was he tithed of the spoils of a war. And there's actually history of, in Arab lands, there was a spoils of war custom where, people would give spoils to the king of the land where the war was fought. But this was the spoils of war, and not his personal money, his wages for income. Another thing to notice is that how many times did this happen? Once, yeah. Now, why is it that some people take a one-time account of Abraham giving a tithe, spoils of war to a priest king, and say that that's an example for us to give a continual, perpetual 10% of our earned monetary income to a church budget? It's like, I don't see the connection there. So we notice in verse 5 it says that they that are the sons of Levi who receive the office of the priesthood have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. Now, verse 5, see, that's the law, that's the tithing law, and it's referring to the Levitical tithe. Now, if we look in verse 12, we see it says, for the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. And what's the change of the law? If we look down in verse 18, we see it says, for there is verily a disannulling or a canceling of the commandment going before, for the weakness and unprofitableness thereof. And the weakness and unprofitableness of that is the fact that the Levitical priesthood was limited by people who lived and died, and they were the intercessors between man and God, and the tithe, according to the law, was to sustain them in their ministry. But we see from these verses that the actual Mosaic tithe laws are canceled because of the ministry of Jesus being a priest after the order of Melchizedek, which is better than the priesthood of mortal Levites. So we have here in black and white, at least if someone's going to say that we're bound by the Levitical laws, according to verses 5, the command to the Levites to take tithes of their people. Verse 12 says there's a change of the law. Verse 18 says that there's a disannulling of the commandment, which is the commandment of tithing. So at least we know that the commandment, the Mosaic law commandment to tithe is gone. And then we just have to ask, is there anything else in the Bible that in any way commands us to tithe? Yeah, we're just about done here. But I guess that would be about the last passage that I could cover. There's other passages that people will use, but it's more about how to, compensate elders and missionaries and so on, but none of them talk about tithing. But from what we've seen so far, are we commanded to tithe, and if so, how do we do it?
Are we commanded to tithe?
Yeah. Are we as New Testament Christian church believers commanded to tithe, and if so, how do we do it?
Well, I don't think yes and no. We're free to do whatever. I mean,
We're free.
We should do it.
We should
do it.
We should give.
But we're not. We don't have to. But it's a great recommendation to tithe.
Okay.
If someone.
I look at it different myself. I look like we're supposed to, because that's our part of worshiping God. My own opinion.
But you said the word. Are you commanded? Yes. Yeah. What do you feel?
I guess my point of doing all this research and study of looking at all the tithing passages in the law that talks about the nature of the tithe, to whom the tithe was, laws were given, to whom it was for, what it was for, when it was done, it doesn't look to me like those are actually for us. It was the tithe laws were actually the agricultural tax and welfare system for the nation of Israel. And from the New Testament, it looks like as New Testament church believers, we give out of our heart, we give to meet needs, we give out of abundance and cheerfulness and love. But I don't see anything in the New Testament or any connection to tithing that gives any particular, amount or percentage or so on like that. If someone wants to say that giving 10% of your income is a good principle to do, that's fine with me, but I don't see anywhere in the Bible, looking at all of these passages in context, that there's anything that in any way binds us to have to do that in any way. We give to meet needs, we give out of our heart, we give abundantly and cheerfully, but there's no constraints for that. It's whatever we're led by the Spirit to do to meet needs.
I guess we've been taught that it was 10%.
Yeah, we were
over, throughout most of our lives.
Ron was taught 20%.
Yeah.
John.
There's a debate whether there's 1, 2, or 3 different tithes in the tithe law, and where they had the annual tithe, the third-year tithe, and the tithe for the Levites. Some people disagree on whether they represent the same tithe or different tithes, but so there's anything from like 10% to 33% of one's harvest or whatever in the Old Testament, but whether that is or is not the case, I don't see how it applies for us as New Testament church believers that don't live in the nation of Israel and have the theocratic system of government with the Levitical priesthood.
Yeah, I see where you're going, but we just I don't know. I guess we just been taught from all my life to 10% if you can afford it, and give. And
well, yeah, there's nothing wrong with giving 10% of your income that to a church. That's good.
I think the biggest argument that I've heard against that was whether it's a net or gross.
Yeah, and mostly
I had people ask me, like, when they're Christians, well, what if we don't have any money to give? And I said, well, you give, but you think that you can give? And I said, God will help you out with the rest. Later on, at least if they just start, a little bit, better than nothing, and it shows that they are trying, but it was always taught 10%.
Yeah, well, I was always taught that too. In fact, all of my family believes that, and so after studying the tithe, in depth, and I have like all the references memorized. I've studied it so many times, and it's just like, boing, something's wrong here. Most of the people who actually preach that you're required to give 10% of your income, calling it a tithe, to your own church, haven't really studied the passages actually talking about tithing, or take verses out of context. They don't actually see the context.
So, well, they'll probably go back to the Old Testament for the 10% then.
But but we learned from that it was always of crops and livestock. It wasn't from someone's earned monetary income. So it was only landowners It was only within the bounds of the nation of Israel.
Right.
And we have the annual tithe festival, which you didn't give that away. You ate it yourself and shared it with Levites. You have the year of the tithe, the third year, which is the only one that people gave away. But it was still always crops and livestock. So only landowners tithe there. After doing all the study, it's like I have to conclude, looking at the New Testament, there's nothing in the New Testament that tells the church in particular that they need to tithe, and that they need to tithe of their monetary income, and that they need to tithe to the church. All I see is cheerful giving to meet needs. And the tithe in particular is only a nation of Israel concept, and it has to do with its form of government. And the Levitical priesthood, which we see in Hebrews chapter 7, that was dissolved because the weakness or unprofitableness of it, because we have the priesthood of Jesus being after the order of Melchizedek, and he's a priest that lives forever, and he's the mediator between God and man. We don't have a priesthood of people that we have to go to intercede to God on our behalf, and that's what the tithe in the Old Testament was for to sustain those people. But we have direct access to God, and so there's no tithe necessary, although in the New Testament, the epistles to the church, the people in the church are told to give cheerfully, abundantly, not of necessity, because God loves a cheerful giver, and we give out of the heart, spirit-led, to meet needs. But there's no constraint to that here's a minimum floor or whatever like that. There's just whatever we give out of our heart, and we give it to meet needs, and we give it cheerfully. That's the way I see from my study. I hope that all this has helped you at least think about some verses that we've seen, and maybe you'll think about whether I'm correct or maybe I'm not correct, but at least we looked at all these passages and see the context.
It actually comes out and says it, so I agree with you on that. I think it's just the way we just fall back on our feet.
Meet everybody, right. And it can be everyone's condition too, I can remember when I just bought a lot and was remodeling, put a lot of money into it, having a new house built at the same time, and our charges was just going up, we was upgrading our house, in different areas, so it was costing us more money. And we had a revival going every night for a week. And anyhow, we went and we felt compelled to give money that we really didn't have, and we had never done this before, see? But how God blessed us, this was my business, and just the doors just started opening like that, and I praised Him for it. But we would not done it if we didn't feel like we was pressed. We're beside us, they didn't pay anything, but it didn't mean that they did anything wrong. You know what I'm saying? But I think if the Lord places something on your heart, you better do what He wants you to do. And if you don't have to do it, then you don't have to do it. If you don't feel like you have to, then I don't think you should feel it. I think we're all condemned on what we believe. If we believe that if I believe I should be paying it, then I should. And if that next person sitting next to me doesn't believe it, then that's their business.
She's got to go, so.
Okay, all right. But you're a real good teacher. Really enjoy your teaching.
Actually, I should switch more.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that lesson from A Blast from the Past, and I hope that you will stay tuned for the next episode of Truth Espresso, and God bless.
Thank you for waking up with Truth Espresso. Good morning, and God bless your day.
Hey friends, Daniel Minnick here again. If you liked waking up to this episode of Truth Espresso, I would really appreciate it if you would rate it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever application you use to listen to Truth Espresso.